The scroll unfurled across the low, lacquered table with a sound like sighing silk. On its aged surface, a storm of ink. Characters dancing in a cursive so fluid and archaic, it looked more like art than language. Read this. Kaito Tanaka, CEO of Tanaka Global Industries, and a man who moved with the chilling precision of a striking cobra, gestured at the scroll. His voice, a low baritone, was deceptively soft, yet it sliced through the hushed reverence of San Francisco's most exclusive restaurant, Edo. He was not speaking to the two American executives cowering opposite him. His gaze, cold and dark as a winter sea, was fixed on the waitress. "Enlighten these gentlemen with its meaning," he continued, a ghost of a smile playing on his thin lips, "and I will transfer $100 million to your account before the sun rises." He expected the blush of shame, the stammered apology, the hurried retreat. He never expected her to set down her silver water pitcher, her movements slow and deliberate, and truly look. What happened in the next 3 minutes would not only secure a young woman's future, it would unravel the meticulously crafted world of a corporate emperor, proving that the deepest knowledge is not a commodity to be bought, but a legacy to be honored, and that a person's value is not determined by the apron they wear. The scent of yuzu and hinoki wood was the perfume of Clara Vance's purgatory. At 22, her life was a repeating cycle of 16-hour shifts, the delicate clink of sake cups, and the polite, empty smiles of the city's elite. She moved through the minimalist elegance of Edo with an efficiency that bordered on invisibility. Her black uniform was severe, her brown hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. To the patrons who debated billion-dollar mergers over plates of bluefin toro that cost more than her monthly rent, she was a pair of hands, a silent functionary in their grand theater of wealth. But behind the practiced neutrality of Clara's hazel eyes, a different world existed. It was a world of dusty libraries, the smell of old paper, and the gentle, rumbling voice of her grandfather, Arthur Vance. He had been a professor, a titan in the field of East Asian studies, a man who could coax stories from a single brushstroke of a 1,000-year-old poem. After her parents' car accident when she was 8, he had become her entire world. He hadn't raised her with fairy tales, but with the tales of Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon. He hadn't taught her to cook with recipes, but by explaining the wabi-sabi philosophy of finding beauty in imperfection, even in a slightly misshapen onigiri. He taught her his life's passion, kuzushiji, the flowing, cursive script of classical Japanese literature, a language so complex and nuanced that even most modern Japanese speakers couldn't decipher it. For Clara, it was not an academic exercise. It was the secret language she shared with the person she loved most. It was the ink that flowed through the veins of her childhood. That world had crumbled 6 months ago, not in a crash of steel, but in the sterile quiet of a hospital room. A sudden, vicious illness had taken her grandfather, leaving her not only with a grief that felt like a physical weight, but with a mountain of medical debt that his modest academic pension couldn't begin to cover. Her own college plans, her dreams of following in his footsteps, had dissolved overnight. She traded his library for a restaurant, his ancient texts for endless orders of omakase. Her sharp, analytical mind, once trained to unravel the subtleties of Heian period poetry, was now a finely tuned machine for remembering who had the gluten allergy and which table preferred their water without lemon. Tonight, the air in Edo was charged with a unique, high-stakes voltage. The staff had been briefed by the manager, Mr. Harrison, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a steel rod. Kaito Tanaka was not just another wealthy diner. He was a legend, a specter from the East. His company was in the final stages of a hostile takeover of a beloved local robotics firm, a deal the city's business pages had been covering with breathless anxiety. When Tanaka arrived, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. He was flanked by 2 severe-looking assistants and his ever-present head of security, a barrel-chested man named Kenji. Tanaka himself was immaculate in a custom-tailored suit that whispered its expense. He was not handsome in a conventional sense. His features were too sharp, his face a mask of disciplined austerity. His eyes missed nothing, assessing, cataloging, and dismissing everything they landed on. Clara was assigned to his private dining room, Her stomach churned, not with awe, but with a familiar, weary dread. She recognized the species. Men who wielded their power like a weapon, for whom the world was divided into assets and obstacles. The sake is to be poured to this line, precisely, one of Tanaka's assistants instructed, pointing to a faint mark on the delicate ceramic cup. His tone suggesting Clara was incapable of understanding such a complex directive. And Mr. Tanaka will not be disturbed. Clara inclined her head, her face a perfect blank. As she served the first course, a delicate arrangement of sashimi, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation. The two American executives, the founders of the robotics firm, were clearly on the defensive. One of them, an older man named Ben Carter with kind, tired eyes and a rumpled suit, was trying to hold his ground. Mr. Tanaka, the patented neural interface is the soul of our company. To cede complete control of the IP, it's not something we can agree to, Carter said, his voice strained. Tanaka took a slow, deliberate sip of his sake. Mr. Carter, the soul of a company is its profitability. Your soul is bleeding money. I am offering it a transfusion. You are offering me resistance. It is illogical. His English was perfect, each word a polished, sharpened stone. Clara felt a flicker of sympathy for the older man. He looked like a weary bulldog facing a panther. As she moved around the table, refilling water glasses, her gaze fell upon the menu stand in the corner. The restaurant's name, Edo, Jianghu, was brushed in a stylish, modern calligraphy. But something was off. The second character, Hu, was subtly malformed, a common mistake for artists who prioritized style over accuracy. Her grandfather would have scoffed, launched into a 10-minute lecture on the evolution of that specific radical. The thought brought a sharp pang of grief. She pushed it down, retreating into the professional shell that kept her sane. Her job was to serve, not to notice. The negotiation wore on, growing more brutal with each course. Tanaka wasn't just negotiating, he was dissecting, eviscerating the company's financials, their projections, their very reason for being. He used logic as a bludgeon, data as a garrote. He was cornering them, and he was enjoying it. Finally, as dessert was cleared, Tanaka leaned back, a predator signaling the end of the hunt. Your sentimentality is your weakness, Mr. Carter, he said, his voice laced with a cold finality. You speak of soul and passion. These are concepts for artists, for poets, not for men who build the future. He paused, then reached into an exquisite leather briefcase beside him. He produced not a sheaf of papers, but a silk-wrapped scroll. He placed it on the table, the silence in the room suddenly profound. In my culture, Tanaka said, his eyes glinting as he slowly unwrapped the silk, we understand that true strength, true genius, lies in subtlety, in understanding layers of meaning that are not immediately apparent. He unrolled the scroll. The breathtakingly complex Kuzushiji script flowed across the page. Clara, standing by the service station, felt her breath catch. She recognized the style, the rhythm of the characters. It was a replica, an exquisitely made one, of a poem by Ono no Kamachi, one of the greatest poets of the Heian period, a woman known for her passionate, complex, and ultimately tragic verses. Tanaka looked at the two Americans, their faces a mixture of confusion and intimidation. This is a poem from the 9th century. Its beauty is matched only by its complexity. To read it requires more than just knowledge of the language. It requires an understanding of our history, our philosophy, our soul. The way he said the word was a direct, pointed insult to Ben Carter. His gaze swept past the cowed executives, past his impassive assistants, and it landed on Clara. He saw her, a piece of the restaurant's decor, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the calligraphy. He saw a prop for the final act of his performance. A cruel, theatrical smile touched his lips. He raised his voice, ensuring everyone in the room was his captive audience. But perhaps I am being unfair, he announced, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He pointed a long, manicured finger directly at Clara. You, waitress. Clara froze. The silver pitcher in her hand suddenly felt like it weighed a ton. Every head at the table swiveled towards her. "How about you?" Tanaka continued, the sneer in his voice now a sharpened blade. He gestured grandly toward the scroll. "You seem captivated. Read this. Enlighten these gentlemen with its meaning, and I will transfer $100 million to your account before the sun rises." The assistants chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound. Kenji, the bodyguard, allowed a grim smile. The air grew thick and suffocating with her humiliation. It was a monstrous joke, a piece of corporate theater designed to crush his opponents by demonstrating that their entire world, including the people who served them, was beneath his notice. He was using her as a punchline to a joke they didn't even understand. He expected her to turn scarlet, to stammer, to flee. For a heartbeat, the shame was a physical blow. She felt the cheap fabric of her uniform, the ache in her feet from 1,000 hours of standing, the crushing weight of her dead-end life. But then she looked at the scroll again. The characters weren't just ink on paper. They were her grandfather's voice. "Listen, Clara. Don't just read the words. Listen to the poet's heart, her Kokoro." She saw the arrogant smirk on Tanaka's face, a man using a piece of her soul as a tool for his petty cruelty. And in that moment, the waitress receded, and the scholar, the prodigy, the granddaughter of Arthur Vance, rose to the surface. The years of grief, of repressed intellect, of stifled passion for the beautiful, intricate world she had lost, coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of defiance. He thought she was invisible. He thought she was a joke. He had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. The world seemed to fall away. The murmur of the restaurant became a distant hum. All Clara could see was the scroll, Tanaka's mocking face, in the two paths diverging before her. One led to continued quiet humiliation, the other to an act of catastrophic, unimaginable rebellion. Her training, her every survival instinct, screamed at her, "Apologize, retreat. The customer is always right. Be invisible." Across the dining room, she saw Mr. Harrison start to move towards them, his face a mask of controlled fury. He would fire her. No, he would have her thrown out. She'd be blacklisted. The medical bills would pile up, higher and higher. But the ghost of her grandfather whispered in her ear, "Ono no Komachi," the poem of the fading flower. He thinks it's about beauty. He doesn't understand. It's about regret. It's about a life unlived. Tanaka's smirk widened, misinterpreting her stillness as fear. "What is the matter?" he goaded, his voice a silken weapon. "No hidden talents? Or is the task simply beyond you?" His words were meant to be the final, crushing blow. Instead, they were the flint striking steel. "Beyond you?" He had no idea what was beyond and what was inside. Clara's gaze lifted from the scroll and met his. The mask of the polite waitress fell away, and for the first time that night, she let him see the person behind it. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now dwarfed by a brilliant, blazing anger. "May I?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it was so unexpected, so utterly out of place, that it commanded an absolute silence. Tanaka's smirk faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. The two executives stared, slack-jawed. Mr. Harrison, now only 10 feet away, stopped dead in his tracks. Kaito Tanaka recovered, his expression shifting to one of intrigued cruelty. He was a man who enjoyed watching things break, and this promised to be a fascinating spectacle. "By all means," he purred, gesturing to the scroll with a magnanimous wave. Clara walked toward the table, each step feeling both impossibly heavy and strangely light. She could feel the stares of everyone in the room, a physical pressure on her skin. She ignored them. She ignored the frantic, warning look from Ben Carter. She ignored the impending explosion of Mr. Harrison. She stood before the table, not as a servant, but as an academic before a lectern. For a terrifying second, her mind threatened to betray her, a white wave of panic washing away the years of study. "What are you doing? You're going to make a fool of yourself." She took a single deep breath. She pictured her grandfather's study, the scent of paper and jasmine tea, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows. The panic receded. The knowledge returned. She didn't reach for the scroll. She didn't need to. She knew the poem by heart. She began to speak. Hana no iro wa, she began, her pronunciation of the classical Japanese, perfect, resonant, and clear. The sound of the ancient language in the sterile, modern room was jarring, beautiful. Tanaka's eyebrows shot up. She recited the entire poem from memory, her voice steady, imbued with a subtle, sorrowful cadence that matched the verse perfectly. When she finished, the silence was absolute, but she wasn't done. You believe this poem is about the fading of beauty, she said, her gaze locked on Tanaka. It was not a question. It was a statement. It is a common and shallow interpretation. She switched to flawless, academic English. The poet, Ono no Kamachi, is not merely lamenting the loss of her looks. She is using the cherry blossom, a symbol of transient beauty, as a metaphor for a life spent in idle contemplation, nagame, while the world and love passed her by. The key is the double meaning of nagame, which can mean lost in thought or long rains. She is saying her life was wasted in lonely rains, in useless daydreams. She took a step closer, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. She is describing the regret of a brilliant woman whose passion and intellect were trapped by the conventions of her time, a spirit that withered on the vine, unseen, unused. It is not a poem about vanity. It is a poem about the tragedy of wasted potential. She let the last words hang in the air, a deliberate echo of her own life, a truth he could not possibly comprehend, but one that filled the space between them. Then she did something even more audacious. She looked at the signature on the replica scroll. And the artist who copied this, she added, her tone now crisp and analytical, while skilled, has an unsteady hand on the final radical of Kamachi's name. A forger. A good one. But not perfect. She had not only translated the poem, she had dissected its soul, exposed its deepest meaning, and critiqued the very object he had used to exert his dominance. She had taken his weapon and turned it back on him with devastating precision. She held Kaito Tanaka's gaze for one more second, letting him see the full, unvarnished truth of her intellect. Then the waitress returned. The mask of polite neutrality slipped back into place. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice once again quiet, deferential. And without waiting for an answer, she turned, walked calmly past the petrified Mr. Harrison, pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, and left a world of shattered silence in her wake. The kitchen was a bedlam of controlled chaos, a world away from the serene dining room. The clash of pans, the roar of the gas burners, the clipped shouts of the chefs. It was the soundtrack of Clara's life. Tonight, it felt like a shield. She leaned against a cold stainless steel prep table, her legs threatening to give out from under her. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance began to recede, leaving a terrifying, trembling emptiness. "Clara! What in the hell was that?" a voice hissed beside her. It was Marco, another server, his young face pale with a mixture of shock and vicarious terror. Harrison looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. "You're so fired. What did you say to that guy?" "I don't know," Clara whispered, pressing the cool metal of the table against her forehead. And in a way, it was true. She didn't know who that person was who had spoken with such authority, such fire. It was a ghost. Her grandfather's ghost, speaking through her, a ghost that had just torched her life. Back in the private dining room, the silence had curdled into something thick and heavy. The two American executives, Carter and his partner, stared at the empty space where Clara had stood, as if they'd just witnessed an act of impossible magic. Mr. Harrison was frozen just inside the doorway, his face ashen, his mind furiously trying to process a scenario so far beyond the scope of his employee handbook that it might as well have been an alien invasion. Kaito Tanaka had not moved. His face, usually a mask of unshakable composure, was utterly blank. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and control, was struggling to reconcile the data points. The cheap uniform, the deferential posture, the menial task, and the voice that had just spoken with the authority of a tenured professor from the University of Tokyo. She hadn't just read the poem, she had inhabited it. She had peeled back its layers with an effortless intimacy that he, a man who prided himself on his cultural heritage, had never grasped. And the final casual comment about the forgery, it was a flick of the wrist that had disemboweled his entire performance. He had chosen that specific replica because its forgery was a closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of scholars and the curator of the museum that held the original. He was not just a wealthy man, he was a product of a rigorous classical education. He knew enough to know that he had just been in the presence of an intellect that dwarfed his own in this specific, deeply personal arena. Kenji, Tanaka said, his voice quiet, strained. His head of security, who had been standing impassively by the door, took a step forward. Get Professor Watanabe on the phone, now. Professor Watanabe was the world's foremost authority on Heian literature, a living national treasure in Kyoto. Kenji, his face betraying a flicker of surprise, but his movements immediate and precise, stepped out of the room. Ben Carter, the robotics executive, finally found his voice. It was hoarse. Mr. Tanaka? Who was that? Tanaka didn't answer. He picked up his sake cup, but his hand was not quite steady. He placed it back down. The humiliation was a cold fire spreading through his veins. He had attempted to demonstrate the shallowness of these Americans, and in doing so, had his own profound ignorance laid bare by one of their waitresses. The irony was a physical pain. Kenji returned and handed Tanaka a satellite phone. Watanabe-sensei on the line, sir. Tanaka took the phone. Sensei, he began, his voice betraying a hint of strain. I have a question. The Iwasaki Collection's replica of Komachi's Hana no Irawa scroll, the signature, is there an issue with it? There was a pause, and then the reedy, ancient voice of the professor crackled through the phone. Ah, Tanaka-san, a very astute question. Yes, it is a near-perfect copy, but the forger, a man named Hideo, had a characteristic flaw, a tremor in the final stroke of the character, Machi. It is almost undetectable. Only a true expert, someone who has spent a lifetime with Komachi's original work, would ever notice. Why do you ask? Tanaka's knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. No reason, Sensei. Thank you for your time. He ended the call, slowly placing the phone back on the table. The blankness on his face was replaced by a dark, complex storm of emotions. Shock, rage, and something else. Something he hadn't felt since he was a boy who had failed his first calligraphy lesson. Shame. Kaito Tanaka, the man who moved markets and dismantled corporations, had been intellectually checkmated, and his opponent was a waitress. He looked up, his eyes locking on the terrified Mr. Harrison. The waitress, he commanded, his voice a low growl that promised consequences. The one who was just here. Where is she? Mr. Harrison jolted into action, practically bowed. In the kitchen, Mr. Tanaka. I will fetch her immediately. I am mortified. Her insolence is unforgivable. She will be terminated and removed from the premises this instant. He turned to scurry toward the kitchen, eager to perform the execution and appease the enraged Titan. No! Tanaka's voice stopped the manager as effectively as a physical wall. The CEO rose from his chair. He was not a large man, but his presence seemed to fill the room, radiating an aura of immense coiled power. You will stay here. You will do nothing. He strode toward the kitchen doors himself. His assistants and Kenji moved to follow, but he waved them off with a sharp, impatient gesture. This he had to do alone. The moment he pushed through the swinging doors, the kitchen's symphony of chaos faltered and died. Chefs froze mid-chop. Dishwashers stared, their hands dripping with soapy water. The sudden appearance of the billionaire predator in their gritty, frantic world was so incongruous, it broke reality. His eyes scanned the room and found her instantly. She was leaning against a counter, her back to him, Marco trying to speak to her in urgent, hushed tones. You? Tanaka's voice boomed, cutting through the last vestiges of kitchen noise. Clara flinched and turned slowly. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and lingering defiance. She looked fragile and small, surrounded by the industrial steel and steam, still wearing that absurdly formal uniform. The contrast between her appearance and the power she had just displayed was a cognitive dissonance that made Tanaka's head spin. We need to talk, he said. His tone was no longer mocking or theatrical. It was flat, hard, and intense. Before Clara could form a response, Mr. Harrison, unable to restrain himself, burst through the doors behind Tanaka. "Miss Vance, you are fired. Collect your belongings and vacate the premises. I will not have my staff insulting and harassing our guests." Tanaka turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. He fixed Mr. Harrison with a glare so frigid it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You are the one who will be silent, or your next conversation will be with the board of directors of the company that holds the lease on this building, which, as of 5 minutes ago, is me." He had just bought the restaurant. It was a petty, impulsive display of power, but it was effective. Mr. Harrison's jaw snapped shut, a strangled squeak escaping his throat. Tanaka turned back to Clara. "This woman is no longer your employee because I am offering her a job." The entire kitchen staff gaped. Clara found her voice, a tremor running through it. "I don't want your job." "The $100 million is yours," he stated, waving a hand as if dismissing a triviality. "It is a matter of honor. A contract will be drawn up, but that is irrelevant now. This is about what you did in that room. Who are you?" "I'm a waitress," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. "Do not insult my intelligence," he shot back, his voice rising. "Waitresses do not quote 9th century poetry and identify master-level forgeries." "Who are you?" His intensity was a physical force, pressing in on her, demanding an answer. Her carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble. The past she had worked so hard to bury was clawing its way out. She didn't want this. She wanted her quiet, anonymous life back. "It was just a lucky guess," she mumbled, looking away. "Luck?" Tanaka let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "There is no luck in that level of expertise. I have funded entire university departments whose professors do not possess your clarity on that subject. I will find out who you are, with or without your cooperation. My resources are considerable. It will be far easier for you if you simply tell me your name." The threat was unspoken but absolute. He could and would excavate her life, peel back every layer of her privacy, and expose the grieving, indebted scholar she was trying so desperately to hide. The thought was more terrifying than his anger. Marco, seeing her distress, took a half-step forward. "Sir, I think you should leave her alone. She's—" Kenji, who had followed his employer to the doorway, placed a hand the size of a dinner plate on Marco's shoulder, a silent, immovable warning to stand down. Clara looked at Tanaka, at the relentless, analytical curiosity in his eyes. He wasn't just angry. He was a man facing a puzzle he was pathologically driven to solve. The game was over. "Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Clara Vance." Tanaka nodded slowly, the name echoing in the vast databanks of his memory. It meant nothing to him. Yet. He turned to Kenji. "I want to know everything about Clara Vance. Schools, family, academic history. I want to know what she had for breakfast this morning. Use any resource necessary. I want a complete file on my desk by the time I land in Tokyo." Kenji gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and vanished. Tanaka turned back to Clara. The anger in his expression was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. A look of profound, calculating possession. It was the look of a collector who had just discovered an object of priceless, impossible rarity. "You and I have a great deal to discuss, Miss Vance," he said. It was not a promise. It was an inevitability. He then turned and swept out of the kitchen, his entourage parting before him like the sea, leaving a stunned, silent kitchen and a terrified young woman in his wake. Clara had won the battle of the scroll, but in doing so, she had just become the single most fascinating and targeted puzzle in a billionaire's world. The next 36 hours were a descent into a surreal, fever dream. A terrified Mr. Harrison informed Clara she was on indefinite paid leave, his voice trembling. She left Edo not through the back alley staff entrance, but through the front doors, a courtesy she had never been granted. The cool San Francisco fog felt alien on her skin, as if she were a deep-sea creature suddenly brought to the surface. She went home to the tiny book-filled apartment that had once been her grandfather's. She didn't know how to begin to process what had happened. The $100 million felt like a fiction, a number too large to be real. It was a solution to all her problems that had, in turn, created a new one of terrifying magnitude. Kaito Tanaka. She spent the night sleepless, surrounded by her grandfather's books, their silent wisdom offering no comfort against the modern, invasive power of a man who could buy the world. Meanwhile, aboard a Gulfstream G-150ER, slicing through the darkness over the Pacific, Tanaka's global intelligence apparatus was at war. The name Clara Vance was a ghost. Initial searches brought up the mundane: employment records at Edo and 2 other low-end cafes, a driver's license, a social security number, the profile of a person deliberately living off the grid. "This is nothing," Tanaka snapped into his satellite phone, his voice tight with impatience. He sat in his minimalist office at 41,000 feet, the replica scroll laid out before him. Dig deeper. University records, academic grants, LexisNexis. Search for the surname Vance in connection with East Asian studies. He was a man obsessed. The incident was a flaw in his perfect world, an anomaly his mind was compelled to understand and contain. The thought that such a mind could be serving him tea was an offense against the natural order of things as he perceived it. 2 hours later, as the jet began its descent into Tokyo, the file arrived, and the world snapped into focus. It wasn't Clara's file that provided the key. It was her grandfather's, Professor Arthur Vance, a name Tanaka knew, a legend, a Westerner who had been decorated by the Japanese government for his contributions to the preservation of classical literature. A man Tanaka's own father had spoken of with profound respect. He had read Vance's seminal work on the tale of Genji as a young man. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Attached was a brief academic biography of the professor, and in the final paragraph, a mention of his only next of kin. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Kaito Tanaka, and the world rushed back in. A collective held breath was released in a cascade of whispers and shuffling feet. The symphony of chaos resumed, but its rhythm was fractured, hesitant. Every eye was on her. Clara felt the weight of their stares like a physical shroud, pinning her against the cold steel of the prep table. Her own breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, as if she had just surfaced from a deep, crushing ocean. The adrenaline that had forged her spine into a rod of indignant steel was dissolving, leaving behind a terrifying, nauseating tremor that started in her knees and radiated through her entire body. "Clara! Clara!" Marco was beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder, afraid to make contact. "Are you okay? What? Who? He offered you a job?" She couldn't form words. Her mind was a maelstrom of her grandfather's voice, Tanaka's glacial fury, and the catastrophic, echoing silence of the dining room. She had done more than talk back. She had detonated a bomb in the center of her own life, and she was standing at ground zero, waiting for the fallout to incinerate her. Mr. Harrison, his face the color of spoiled milk, approached her with the tentative steps of a man nearing a wild, unpredictable animal. His earlier blustering rage had been replaced by a raw, naked fear. The man he had tried to appease had bought the building from under him with a verbal aside, a casual display of power so absolute it defied comprehension. And she, Clara, was somehow the cause. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice a reedy croak. "You are, please, you are on indefinite paid administrative leave, effective immediately. Please, just go home. We will call you." It was a dismissal wrapped in the language of human resources, a desperate plea for her to simply vanish before she could cause any more cosmic disruption. She nodded numbly, stripping off her apron with fumbling fingers. The familiar cheap fabric felt alien, a costume from a life that had ended 10 minutes ago. She walked through the kitchen, a path parting before her as if she were a ghost. No one met her eyes. She was no longer one of them. She was something other, something dangerous. She didn't leave through the back alley, past the overflowing dumpsters, and the lingering scent of stale beer. Mr. Harrison himself escorted her through the hushed, elegant dining room, out the grand front entrance, and into the San Francisco fog. The damp, cool air was a shock against her overheated skin. It felt real, tangible, in a way the last hour had not. The streetlights cast halos in the mist. A cable car rattled by in the distance, its cheerful bell a sound from a different planet. Her apartment, the one she had shared with her grandfather, was a sanctuary of ghosts. It was small, cluttered, and smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint, lingering aroma of the jasmine tea he had brewed every afternoon. Books were not decorations here. They were the architecture. They were stacked on the floor. They overflowed from shelves. They formed precarious towers on the coffee table. Each spine was a memory, each page a conversation she could no longer have. She collapsed onto the worn velvet armchair, his chair, and the trembling finally gave way to a wave of soul-shaking sobs. They were not tears of defiance or victory. They were tears of pure, unadulterated terror. What had she done? She had stared into the abyss, and the abyss, in the form of Kato Tanaka, had not only stared back, but had decided it found her interesting. He wasn't just going to fire her, he was going to excavate her. "I want to know everything about Clara Vance." The words were a promise of violation, a threat to peel back the anonymous, protective shell she had so carefully constructed around her grief. He would find the scholarship she had abandoned. He would find the thesis that was her heart poured onto a page. He would find the mountain of debt that was the final, ugly price of her grandfather's last few months of life. He would find everything she had run from, everything she had tried to bury beneath 16-hour shifts in the practiced humility of a servant. She had courted the attention of a predator, and now he knew her scent. The $100 million he had mentioned felt like a cruel joke, a mythical beast. The real price would be her quiet, broken life, which he would now surely consume. Aboard the Gecko, his Gulfstream G650ER, the silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of recycled air and the faint clink of ice as Tanaka swirled a glass of Yamazaki 25. The amber liquid remained untouched. His gaze was fixed, unseeing, on the curvature of the earth, a blue and white marble suspended in the velvet black of the stratosphere. The city lights of San Francisco receded behind them, a fading constellation of human ambition. His mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and strategy, was malfunctioning. It kept replaying the scene, trying to process the dissonant data points, the cheap polyester uniform, the calloused fingers that had set down the water pitcher, the practiced, deferential posture, and then the voice. A voice that spoke not just with knowledge, but with kokoro, the heart, the soul of the matter. A voice that had dissected a masterpiece and casually unmasked a forgery with the bored confidence of an old master. The initial fury had cooled, crystallizing into something far more complex and disturbing. It was the icy horror of a man who prides himself on his perception, realizing he is, in some fundamental way, blind. He had used a piece of his own culture, a poem of exquisite subtlety, as a bludgeon. He had wielded it with all the grace of a barbarian to make a point about nuance to men he considered shallow. And his entire performance, his entire assertion of cultural superiority, had been exposed as a cheap, ignorant parlor trick by a waitress. The shame was a physical sensation, a cold knot tightening in his gut. It was not the public shame of being outmaneuvered in a boardroom. He could process that, counter it, destroy the opponent. This was a private, profound dishonor. He had desecrated something he claimed to revere. "Kenji," he said, his voice flat. His head of security emerged from the forward cabin. "Sir." "The initial report on Clara Vance. What is it?" "Superficial, sir," Kenji replied, his tone professionally neutral. "Born in Palo Alto. No criminal record. High school transcripts are sealed. No university attendance on record. Employment history consists of 3 service industry jobs since she turned 21. No social media presence. No credit cards, only a debit account with a low balance. She is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost." Tanaka's jaw tightened. A ghost. A deliberate erasure. It was a sign of either someone with nothing or someone hiding everything. "That is unacceptable. This is not a casual inquiry. I want you to divert the resources of the M&A opposition research team, the ones we used for the Société Générale buyout. I want every database queried, every public and sealed record accessed. I am authorizing Level 4 invasive protocols, financials, academic, medical. Cross-reference the surname Vance with any academic institution on the West Coast specializing in East Asian studies. I want to know who her parents were, who her grandparents were. I want to know the name of her first pet. Find her. Sir, Kenji said, a flicker of something, surprise, concern, in his stoic eyes. Level 4 was reserved for dismantling the lives of hostile CEOs and recalcitrant politicians. To turn that cannon on a waitress was unprecedented, but he simply bowed his head. It will be done. For the next 4 hours, Tanaka sat in silence as his private global intelligence network, a machine built to dissect corporations and predict market shifts, was deployed to unravel the life of a single, grieving young woman. Reports trickled in, delivered by his assistants on encrypted tablets. Financial records first. A vast, suffocating web of medical debt linked to a recently closed estate. The name on the death certificate, Arthur Vance. The name struck Tanaka with the force of a physical blow. Arthur Vance. It wasn't possible. He strode to the small library on his jet, a collection of curated masterpieces, and pulled a volume from the shelf. Floating Bridge of Dreams, a Western interpretation of the Genji Monogatari. By Professor Arthur Vance, a book his own father, a stern man not given to praise, had called the work of a man with a Japanese soul. His hands were unsteady as he keyed the name into his terminal. The file Kenji's team was building began to populate with horrifying speed. Professor Arthur Vance, a titan of his field. Recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun from the Japanese government, a visiting scholar at Waseda, a man who had dedicated 50 years of his life to the very culture Tanaka had just used as a weapon. And then, the final pieces. A faded university newsletter article from 20 years ago, profiling the famous professor, mentioning that he was the sole guardian of his young granddaughter, Clara, and finally a file from Stanford University, unsealed by a contact deep within the administration. Clara Vance, a perfect record, a full academic scholarship, the President's Award for Excellence in the Humanities, and a copy of her undergraduate thesis, submitted and approved for distinction just before her withdrawal. The title made the breath catch in Tanaka's throat. Nagami no Kokoro, the poetic duality of regret in the verses of Ono no Kamachi. He didn't need to read it. He knew with absolute soul-crushing certainty what it would say. She hadn't just studied the poem. She hadn't just memorized it. She had lived inside it. It was the foundation of her own intellectual life. He had walked into her temple, her sacred space, and used her own scripture to mock her. Kaito Tanaka, a man who had never once in his adult life felt out of control, leaned his forehead against the cool plexiglass of the window and stared down at the indifferent ocean. The shame was no longer a cold knot. It was a consuming fire. He had committed an act of profound, unforgivable ignorance. The $100 million he had offered was no longer a prize. It was a pittance, a vulgar insult. Giving her money now would be like trying to pay for a desecrated shrine with a handful of coins. It would only deepen the dishonor. He landed in Tokyo as the sun was rising, casting the imperial palace in hues of rose and gold. But Tanaka felt none of the city's energy. He felt hollowed out. He was a man who solved problems with logic, power, and money. But this was not a problem of that kind. This was a problem of the soul. How do you apologize for a sin you didn't even have the wisdom to recognize you were committing? You don't apologize. You atone. He sat in his office, the city spread out beneath him, and began to design not a solution, but a restoration. He would not hire Clara Vance. You do not hire a priestess. You rebuild her temple. He would not give her a gift. He would restore a legacy. His actions would be as precise, as strategic, and as overwhelming as any hostile takeover he had ever orchestrated. He was going to take over her tragedy, and his weapon of choice would be his limitless fortune. The knock on her door came 2 days later. It was a sound so out of place in her cocoon of grief and anxiety that Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the peephole and saw not a process server or a police officer, but a woman. She was Japanese, perhaps in her late 50s, dressed in a brutally elegant Issey Miyake suit. Her hair was a severe, perfect silver bob, and her expression was one of immaculate neutrality. She radiated a confidence so profound it was, in itself, intimidating. This was not a functionary. This was a general. Clara opened the door a crack. "Miss Clara Vance?" the woman asked. Her English was pristine, tinged with a faint British accent. "My name is Akemi Sato. I am Executive Vice President of Special Projects for Mr. Tanaka. May I have a moment of your time?" Her mind screamed no. It screamed to slam the door, to barricade it with her grandfather's books, to hide. But she knew it was pointless. This was the abyss, arriving on her doorstep in designer clothes. She opened the door. Ms. Sato did not enter. She simply extended a gloved hand, offering 2 items. One was a slim black envelope made of heavy textured paper. The other was an encrypted tablet, its screen dark. "Mr. Tanaka asked me to deliver these to you personally," she said. "He offers his profound apologies for the intrusion. The tablet contains a proposal. The envelope contains a preliminary gesture." Her gaze was direct, impassive, but not unkind. "He awaits your response. There is no deadline." And with a short, formal bow, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking with quiet authority down the worn hallway of the apartment building. Clara closed the door, her hand trembling as she stared at the objects. The envelope felt impossibly heavy. She opened it. Inside was a cashier's check, drawn from a private bank in Zurich. The amount was for $1 million. Tucked behind it was a single thick card. On it, written in Japanese with a fountain pen, were 2 lines. The first was a stark, formal apology. "Si no kondon ha, mingyu wo chenkumono deshita." My actions were without honor. The second was simpler. "Shenshuye arimasen deshita." I am deeply sorry. It was signed with a single, stylized kanji. G-Y-K-E. His given name. $1 million. An apology. It was a stunning, disorienting salvo. It was enough to solve everything. She could pay off the debts, vanish, change her name, live a quiet life of study and solitude anywhere in the world. It was the escape she had craved. Then she picked up the tablet. She pressed her thumb to the screen as instructed, and it flickered to life, displaying a single, multi-page document. It was not a job offer. It was a charter. The Vance Institute for Classical Japanese Studies. Her breath hitched. She read on, her eyes flying across the meticulously drafted legal and philosophical framework. It was to be a nonprofit research foundation. Its mission, the preservation, translation, and academic sponsorship of classical Japanese texts, with a special focus on the literature of the Heian period. It would be endowed with a founding grant of $200 million. It was her grandfather's wildest dream, made manifest. It was every late-night conversation they had ever had, every shared passion, every hope he had for the future of his field, codified in the cold, precise language of a corporate charter. Then she reached the section on governance. The institute would be governed by a board of 5 directors, and for its inaugural term, the charter appointed only 1, granting her the sole and absolute authority to appoint the remaining 4. That director, who would also serve as the institute's president, was named Clara Vance. It was an act of such audacious, breathtaking strategy that she felt dizzy. He wasn't giving her money, he was giving her a kingdom. He wasn't offering her a job, he was offering her a throne, one built from the very substance of her soul. It was a gilded cage, yes, but the cage was the exact shape of her life's purpose. It was a prison where every wall was a library, every window a view into the world she loved. To accept was to be forever bound to him, the silent, invisible force who had created this world for her. To refuse was to betray not only her own future, but the memory of the man who had given her that world in the first place. She looked around the dusty, book-choked apartment. It was a tomb, a memorial to a legacy that was dying with her. The Institute. The Institute was a resurrection. Her terror had not vanished, but for the first time in 2 days, it was joined by something else, a cold, clear, brilliant spark of purpose. He saw her as an asset. He saw her mind as a tool. She would teach him that a legacy is not a tool to be wielded, but a garden to be tended. She found the secure messaging function at the end of the proposal. Her fingers were steady as she typed. The Japanese Tea Garden, Golden Gate Park. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. You will come alone. The fog was a living thing, a soft gray spirit that drifted through the sculpted pines and across the high-arched drum bridge. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cedar. Clara sat on a stone bench overlooking the koi pond, where ancient jewel-toned fish moved like lazy calligraphy strokes beneath the water's surface. She had chosen this place deliberately. It was her grandfather's favorite spot in the city, a place of manufactured tranquility that he had always found both beautiful and deeply ironic. He arrived precisely at 9. He was, as instructed, alone. The absence of his entourage was more striking than their presence had been. Dressed in dark charcoal trousers and a simple black cashmere turtleneck, he looked less like a corporate emperor and more like an austere academic. He seemed diminished by the quiet majesty of the garden, a man of steel and glass in a world of wood and water. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak, but simply inclined his head, waiting. "This institute," Clara began, her voice steady, clear in the hushed air. "What is it? A cage? An apology? Or just a more creative acquisition?" "It is a restoration," Tanaka said, his voice quiet, stripped of its boardroom resonance. "What I broke with my ignorance, I can only attempt to restore with my resources. The mockery was of myself, Miss Vance. I have read your thesis. It is definitive. To stand in the presence of its author, the heir to Arthur Vance's legacy, and to be so blind. It was a failure I cannot tolerate." "So you build a monument to your failure?" she countered, a sharp edge to her voice. "And you put me on display in it?" "I am building a vessel to house a treasure that was being allowed to perish," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I have no desire to own you. I have a desire for access. A mind that sees the world as you do is a strategic asset of incalculable value. The Institute gives you the autonomy to pursue your work, to honor your grandfather. My sole request is that you occasionally allow me to look through your eyes, to bring you a problem of impenetrable complexity and have you reveal its kokoro." There it was, the price. Not money, not servitude. Access. He wanted to plug his empire of logic into her world of soul. She was silent for a long time, watching the carp trace their endless circles. She could feel the power in her hands, the power to accept, to refuse, to negotiate. She was no longer a waitress asking if he would care for more water. She was a queen considering an alliance. "The terms are incomplete," she said finally, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. He inclined his head again. "Proceed. The board will have 5 seats. I will occupy the first. The second will be offered to Mr. Ben Carter." Tanaka's expression remained neutral, but she saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. She was dictating terms not just about the Institute, but about his other business. "Your offer for his company was an execution," she continued, her voice gaining a cold strength she didn't know she possessed. "It will be renegotiated. It will be a partnership, not a conquest. His patents will be licensed, not seized. He will join the board not as a token, but as a permanent advisor on ethical technology and practice. He will be my check against the world you come from." Tanaka considered this. It was illogical, sentimental. She was leveraging this immense opportunity for a man she barely knew, a man who represented the very weakness Tanaka had mocked. And yet, it was brilliant. It built an immediate, unshakable foundation of loyalty. It demonstrated that her principles were not for sale. It made the entire enterprise stronger, more resilient. It was a move he, in his ruthless calculus, had never considered. "Done," he said. "The remaining 3 seats will be held by tenured academics from Stanford, Waseda, and Oxford." I will choose them. Your name and the name Tanaka Global will not be attached to the institute in any public capacity. Your endowment will be routed through a blind trust in Switzerland. You will be a ghost. Your atonement will be anonymous. This was the true test. She was asking him, a man whose name was a brand of power, to erase himself, to perform this grand act of restoration and receive no credit, no glory, to simply pay the price and walk away. He looked at her, at this young woman who sat amidst the serene beauty of the garden, calmly dismantling his world and rebuilding it according to her own moral architecture. He saw the integrity she had inherited, a thing more rare and more valuable than any company on the stock exchange. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his severe features, making him look younger. Your terms are shrewd, Miss Vance. They protect the Institute's integrity, and in doing so, they protect my investment. He paused. They are acceptable. She rose from the bench, her movements fluid and confident. The last traces of the timid, terrified waitress had been burned away. Then, Mr. Tanaka, she said, meeting his gaze as an equal, I believe we have a great deal of work to do. 2 years later, Kaido Tanaka stood in the atrium of the Vance Institute. It was not a monument, it was a living space, a building of light, glass, and pale hinoki wood that seemed to breathe with the quiet energy of the scholars within. His endowment had been the seed, but her vision had been the blueprint. He had kept his word. His name appeared nowhere. To the world, it was the legacy of a great professor, now curated by his brilliant granddaughter. His calls to Clara were infrequent, never social. They were consultations. He would present her with a knot, a hostile negotiation with a foreign government, a seemingly irrational market panic, a complex internal power struggle. She would listen, and then she would reframe it, finding the hidden poetry, the cultural currents, the fear or pride or shame that drove the seemingly logical actors. Her insights had saved him billions, but more than that, they had begun to fundamentally alter the way he saw the world. He found her not in an office, but in the main library, kneeling on a tatami mat before a low table. Spread across it was not an ancient scroll, but a series of satellite images of a contested shipping lane in the South China Sea. Across from her sat a 4-star admiral from the U.S. Navy in Ben Carter, his hair grayer but his eyes no longer tired. Clara looked up and saw him. A warm, easy smile lit her face. There was no deference in it, only recognition. Kei-san, she said, using his given name as she now did in their private consultations. Perfect timing. The admiral believes this is a logistical problem of naval positioning. I believe it is a matter of of national face. The new naval base isn't the objective. It's a statement. They are writing a poem of defiance in the water, and we keep trying to read it like a balance sheet. Ben Carter chuckled. She's been trying to teach us the difference between strategy and poetry for an hour, Kaido. I think we're starting to get it. Tanaka walked over, not as the silent benefactor or the corporate titan, but as a collaborator. He knelt, the expensive fabric of his suit creasing, and looked down at the images. He saw the ships, the vectors, the military hardware. But he forced himself to see more. He tried to see the brushstrokes, the hidden meaning, the tragic verse being written in steel and salt water. He had sought to acquire a unique asset. Instead, he had found a new way of seeing. He had offered a cage, and she had transformed it into a lens, focusing the fierce, brilliant light of her legacy not only on the past, but on the turbulent, complex heart of the present. The world had told Clara Vance she was a servant, but she had understood that the deepest knowledge is its own form of power, and with it, she had not merely rewritten her own contract with the world. She was now teaching the masters of that world a new language,